Art Hansen is an emeritus professor of history and Asian American studies at California State University of Fullerton and its Japanese American project. From 2001 to 2005, he served as senior historian for the Japanese American National Museum, after which he has continued to be a historical consultant. In 2018, two of his books will be published: an edited one, Nisei Naysayer, the memoir of militant Japanese American journalist Jimmie Omura, and an authored one, Barbed Voices, Oral History, Resistance, and the World War II Japanese American Social Disaster. So please put your hands together and please help me welcome Art Hansen.
I'm actually going to talk not so much about my book, because it's not my book. I'm going to talk about Jimmie Omura's book. It's his memoir. Thank you for your kind introduction, Elizabeth, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for taking the time and going to the trouble on a Saturday afternoon of being here today at this book launching for Nisei Naysayer, the memoir of militant Japanese American journalist Jimmie Omura. I'd like to extend the thank you to those people at the Japanese American National Museum who merit recognition for my being here today. First, Ann Burroughs, JANM's visionary president and CEO, who inspired the presentation. Second, Elizabeth Lim, the resourceful and efficient public programs manager at JANM, who's just spoken to you, who arranged for my appearance. And third, John Asaki and his award-winning staff in JANM's Frank H. Watasi Media Arts Center for providing technical support for my talk. Also, let me say that I am dedicating today's event to the cherished memory of two recently departed Nisei resistor giants, Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, 1924-2018, and Yoshi Koramiya, 1923-2018. Both of them, as deeply valued friends and colleagues, greatly aided James Omura in the writing of his memoir and me in the editing of it. I profoundly regret that they are not with us here today, but I suspect that most of us in attendance can feel their absent presence. I will say that Irene Koramiya is here today, though. Irene, why don't you stand up? I would like to begin today by introducing you to the author of the Nisei Naysayer memoir, the late James Matsumoto Omura, 1912-1994, by way of two outtake interview segments done with him for Frank Abe's award-winning 2000 documentary film, Conscience and the Constitution. The first of these segments focuses on Omura's February 23rd, 1942, powerful and singular testimony at the Toland Committee's San Francisco hearings. The second interview segment deals with Omura's down-in-the-dumps state of mind in his immediate post-World War II days in Denver, and it also captures his resolute determination to avenge and redress the Japanese American Citizens League's, JACL's, leadership's mistreatment and even demonization of him. So now let's have the film clips, okay?
The least a person could do is at least protest. There was no protest. I protested. I was requested by the Toland Committee to appear at the last minute, and I went before them as the last witness of the San Francisco hearings. And I unequivocally opposed eviction of Japanese Americans.
They'd already made a decision to have an evacuation, so the Toland Committee hearings were at bottom a farce. But they were interesting nonetheless for some of the things that came up at them, and Mike Masaoka and Jimmie Omura both testified.
Before a joint congressional committee in February 1942, Omura protested the planned evacuation as unnecessary, rejected the leadership of the JACL, and asked,
"Has the Gestapo come to America? Have we not risen in righteous anger at Hitler's mistreatment of the Jews? Then is it not incongruous that citizen Americans of Japanese descent should be similarly mistreated and persecuted?" I felt that there would be a multitude, to use my word, a multitude of Japanese Americans who would appear before this committee at their various hearings in Portland, Seattle, and Los Angeles, and would protest this eviction. As it turned out, there was not a single protest. I did tell them that if they're unwilling to fight for their rights, they didn't deserve it.
Mike was fairly embarrassing in the sense that he was so obsequious and so accommodating to the testifiers and gave out the idea that Japanese Americans would do anything. Anything.
Yes, we cooperated in our removal because we were afraid of what would happen. You want people murdered on the streets? You want tanks to come in and destroy the little ghettos that we had enjoyed? I think we had no alternative.
I thought they betrayed Japanese America. Well, he says if we all didn't evacuate, that the army would come in with men, with guns and tanks and assassinate us. I didn't believe that was possible. He used this fear to encourage the Japanese public to follow the JACL line. The primary responsibility lies with the United States government for violating our constitutional rights. But the JACL went hand in glove with the government, and I can't see how you could divorce that from the responsibility when you're weighing the facts. They didn't stand up and represent the Japanese American. They sold themselves to the government. A lot of people may not agree with it, but I was right there. Well, when I was acquitted, I felt that I was vindicated. But when I came back to Denver and then tried to obtain work, because I was flat broke by then, I was hounded from one job after another. It took me 3 months to finally find a job. It was one of these subtle sort of things. You could feel it. You could feel the tenseness. I was in the bowling league and I could feel the tenseness. And it got so bad that I quit bowling. It was no fun, I can tell you that. I have dropped into obscurity, such as the JACL and government agency wished. Today, there is no one to challenge the JACL, and they are again reassembling their forces, reactivating their chapters, and they are shouting from the rooftops what splendid and worthwhile things they did for the Japanese in America. And the Japanese are listening and believing like sheep. I shall never degrade myself to make peace with an organization which would throttle the press against criticism, which would employ the influences of government agencies and civic leaders to shoot down an opponent, which would hound and yelp for elimination without any fundamental or concrete basis an individual whom they consider an enemy. It is true the JACL has roundly discredited me, but I simply bide the time when once again I shall arise to confound them, and confound them I shall. I wrote that. Must be mad.
Let us now turn our attention to Nisei Naysayer, which, of course, is an extended confounding of the JACL. Here is how I open my introduction to his memoir in Nisei Naysayer. James Matsumoto Omura was the foremost editorial voice raised against the U.S. government's World War II exclusion and incarceration of Japanese Americans. He was also the chief spokesperson decrying the Japanese American Citizens League's collaborative role in this shameful development. The lone Nikkei journalist to editorialize against the JCL endorsed federal policy of drafting imprisoned Japanese Americans into the military. Omura was as well the first Nikkei to seek governmental redress and reparations for wartime violations of civil liberties and human rights. The heroic role he played in redeeming the tarnished repute and self-esteem of the Japanese American community has been grossly underrecognized and generally unheralded by Nikkei and non-Nikkei Americans alike. Without question, James Omura deserves to be accorded a place of honor commensurate with that already consecrated for Nisei resistors Gordon Hirabayashi, Minoru Yasui, Fred Korematsu, and Mitsui Endo. Now, along these lines, there are a few steps that I propose should be taken to rectify the heretofore appalling neglect of James Omura in Japanese American and U.S. history. First, prominent attention should be assigned to James Omura in the Common Ground exhibit of this museum as part of its transformative and revitalized agenda to foreground civil liberties, social justice, and human rights. This institution is, after all, the foremost citadel of Japanese American history and memory. Second, the bust of James Omura should be installed in Socorro Square, the historic center of Denver's Japantown, along with the busts of three other men deemed as honored heroes by the city's Nikkei population: former Colorado Governor Ralph Carr, Nisei lawyer and social activist Minoru Yasui, and Issei Buddhist priest Yoshitaka Tamai. I have already registered this very recommendation back in March when I spoke about Nisei Naysayer at an event held at Socorro Square, and I will reiterate it when I speak at another Denver event in late October. While Omura was born and raised in Bainbridge Island outside of Seattle, Washington, was educated in both Pocatello, Idaho, and Seattle, and edited publications in Los Angeles and San Francisco, he was a Denver resident from 1942 to 1994. Third, James Omura should be nominated posthumously to receive the highest national award accorded to a U.S. civilian, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. This award has already been bestowed upon Gordon Hirabayashi, Minoru Yasui, and Fred Korematsu, and seems to be in the offing as well for Mitsui Endo. To my mind, however, Omura is not the only voice of resistance connected with the World War II Japanese-American social disaster who now merits serious consideration for this distinguished medal. Among others that I also believe deserve Presidential Medal of Freedom are Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, Wayne Collins, Michi Nishiura Wegelin, Frank Emmy, William Horry, Sue Kunitomi Embry, Louis Goodman, Kiyoshi Okamoto, A.L. Weirin, Yuri Kochiyama, and Ted Nakamura. You likely have your own preferences in this regard. But let me place this situation into proper perspective. In 1980, outgoing U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who had previously conferred Presidential Medals of Freedom on three people, Justice Arthur Goldberg, Jonas Salk, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., now extended them to 14 others, with one of them being John Wayne. This is how a livid journalist at the time responded to this particular selection. John Wayne? Hey, he's not even a good actor. He's not a hero. He just plays the part of heroes. Well, James Omura and the other resistors whose names I've just mentioned did not act out a heroic cinematic part. Rather, they took a real-life heroic stand. As you know, this month marks the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. That event entailed the U.S. government granting redress payments of $20,000 and a formal presidential apology to every surviving U.S. citizen or legal resident immigrant of Japanese ancestry incarcerated during World War II. As is well documented and remembered, the Japanese American Citizen League, along with many other redress organizations and individuals, played a major part in securing this legislation. However, the JACL has never apologized to the Japanese American community for their collaborative role in the U.S. government's eviction and imprisonment operation. This was a failure of leadership. This apology is long overdue. So too is an apology from the JACL to James Omura. Perhaps, however, that organization views apologies in the manner of Earl Warren, who didn't believe in apologies, who, as California's Attorney General, testified at the Tolan Congressional Committee hearings in San Francisco and became what Kerry McWilliams called perhaps the most forceful advocate of mass evacuation. Recall that Omura was the only one at these same hearings who opposed mass evacuation. As Jim Newton wrote in his otherwise laudatory 2006 biography of Warren's long political and judicial career, Justice for All, Earl Warren and the Nation He Made, if Warren never quite owned up to his responsibility for that calamity, the Japanese American removal and imprisonment, he accepted his role in it and moved forward as part of his lifelong, sometimes exasperating determination not to dwell. Maybe the JACL feels the same way. Then, too, while the JACL has very reluctantly extended an apology to the Nisei draft resistors, the organization has never apologized to Omura, the lone journalistic supporter of the Heart Mountain's Fair Play Committee's draft age Nisei men at the Heart Mountain Relocation Center. It was this organization, the FPC, which advocated for restoration of Nisei civil rights as a precondition for compliance with the military draft and counseled non-compliance with the draft in order to create a test case of the lawfulness of conscripting the incarcerated Nisei. For his support of the FPC position, the government not only arrested and jailed Omura and the leadership of the Fair Play Committee, but also charged them with conspiring to counsel others to commit the felony of evading the draft. Although Omura was acquitted by the jury in a case that came before a federal district court in Cheyenne in October-November 1944, this acquittal did not prevent the JACL from castigating Omura as the #1 enemy of the Japanese American community, and in the process doing great harm to his post-World War II employment prospects, his marital situation, and his social relations within the Japanese American community. Which brings us to Omura's memoir, Nisei Naysayer. In a recent email circulated by Frank Chen, he kindly thanks me for finally getting out Jimmie Omura's story in his own words, but then he adds, sadly, Art Hansen is not Nisei or Sansei. Frank is certainly correct in what he says about Nisei Naysayer being in Jimmie Omura's own words, about me taking an eternity to edit Omura's memoir for publication, for which I sincerely apologize, and about me not being neither Nisei nor Sansei. But with respect to this last point, I would hasten to say that both of these two Japanese American generations have invested a great deal into the publication of Nisei Jimmie's autobiographical novel. The two people I chose to critique and copy edit Jimmie's memoir at the outset of the project were the late Mary Tomita Nisei and Steve Yoda, now a prominent Sansei lawyer in Southern California. Mary not only was a friend of Jimmie's, but someone who assisted him in his research and opened up her Oakland home to him when he came west to the Bay Area for research trips. Mary, a close friend of Yuri Kochiyama, was also the author of a very fine 1995 Stanford University Press book entitled Dear Mia, Letters Home from Japan, 1939 to 1946. As for Steve Yoda, he was the first researcher to use the James Omura papers, now housed at Stanford University's Green Library, when he compiled the first and only biographical work on James Omura for a senior honors thesis at Stanford University. Steve's mentor at Stanford was Gordon Chang, in whose Asian American series both Mary Tomita's Dear Mia and Nisei Naysayer are included. In addition to Mary and Steve, another Nisei-Sansei duo have greatly enriched the character and quality of Nisei Naysayer by their contributions to it. The recently deceased Nisei Yoshi Kuramiya provided the book's preface, while the still very active Sansei Frank Abe wrote its afterword. As one of the 63 Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee draft resistors who refused pre-induction physical examination, Yoshi Kuramiya was arrested, tried in June 1944 at a Cheyenne federal court in Wyoming's largest mass trial, and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment at Washington's McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary. In late 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman granted full pardons to Yoshi and all other Nisei draft resistors. From the early 1980s on to the end of his life, Yoshi championed the historical legacy of the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, the World War II Japanese American draft resistors, and James Omura. Moreover, Yoshi and his wife Irene, who is here with us today, figuratively and literally embraced Omura and regularly opened their house to him during his frequent research activities and public appearances in the Los Angeles area. Yoshi was arguably the most articulate, poetic, and philosophical of all the Heart Mountain draft resistors. You can judge for yourself as to the verity of this assessment while listening to the opening section of Yoshi's preface in Nisei Naysayer. James Matsumoto Omura was everything that the Japanese American Citizens League was not. It is difficult to define one without the other. Like two opposing astrological signs, they held in common the relevance of any particular issue because they were inextricably locked onto a common axis, yet held conflicting perceptions and ideologies on dealing with the issue because they approached the subject with a set of opposing survival dynamics. The JACL pragmatically felt the future of Japanese Americans lay in their convincing America of their worthiness and credibility through good deeds, eventually attaining the social acceptance of the broader American public and thereby political empowerment. In short, the end justifies the means. They proceeded to draw an exceedingly wide swath as to the moral and ethical limits of those means. James Omura, on the other hand, saw the ends and means as two phases of a single aspiration. The worthiness of any goal was part and parcel of the moral integrity of the process by which the goal was achieved. In terms of the Nisei second-generation Japanese Americans during World War II crisis, to believe in the primacy of citizenship and therefore our loyalty as a foregone conclusion and not something to be earned or proven. Innocent until proven guilty, to be what we already are. His commitments were based on these precepts. As for Frank Abe, a Sansei actor, journalist, radio reporter, and filmmaker based in Seattle, he featured James Omura in his award-winning 2000 PBS film, Conscience and the Constitution, which we have just seen segments of, on the largest organized resistance in the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. Since that film, he has continued to write intensely about James Omura and the Heart Mountain Draft Resistors on his resistors.com blog. Frank was chiefly responsible as a founding member of the Asian American Journalists Association for that organization presenting James Omura with its first Lifetime Achievement Award in 1989. In Frank Abe's afterword to Nisei Naysayer, he cites a passage from a 1991 letter that he wrote to James Omura. Quote, "I don't want you to feel like you owe me for any past benefaction. On the contrary, I feel I owe you a lot for befriending me and sharing your story with me, and in a greater sense, providing me with a history I can point to with some pride. I only wish I had known about you when I was trying to learn about Japanese America by reading Bill Hosokawa's first book, Nisei, Quiet Americans, and not being able to find myself in it. I felt like saying, those people aren't me. No wonder so many of my generation turned away from Japanese America. There was nothing to be proud of." There is still another Asian American contributor to Nisei Naysayer who was neither a Nisei nor a Sansei, but rather a fourth generation Chinese American, Frank Chen. Frank provided the book's very moving forward, which was his Rafu Shimpo obituary for Omura in 1994. It closed with these words: "Jimmie was at work on his book when he was struck with a heart attack and died in Denver at 6:35 a.m., June 20th, 1994. He had lived to see the resistors he championed begin to be restored to the community. After 40 years of silence and obscurity, Jimmie began to be rediscovered and his work recognized by Asian Americans. The Asian American Journalists Association honored him, the National Coalition for Redress Reparations honored him, but Japanese America, Asia America, never knew Jimmie well enough. When I compiled an acknowledgement list of the people who, based on available evidence, most assisted Omura during the writing of his memoir, 5 names became manifestly apparent: Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, Michi Nishiro Weglin, Lawson Inada, Frank Abe, and Frank Chen. As I duly note in Nisei Naysayer, without them, Omura likely would not have completed his memoir. Permit me now to say that in my considered opinion, had it not been for Inada and Chen, the memoir quite possibly might never have even begun. When they met Omura at the 1981 Seattle hearings of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, at which they were all participants, they spontaneously forged a kinship-like intergenerational bond. It was as if Inada and Chen had found a long-lost uncle, someone who shared their critical point of view on the Japanese-American World War II removal and incarceration experience. With Chen as the point man, what therefore ensued was that Omura was put back in touch with Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee Frank Emmy, whom he had not seen since their 1944 conspiracy trial in Cheyenne. Chen also worked assiduously to locate World War II draft resistors, not only from Heart Mountain, but also some of the other 9 War Relocation Authority concentration camps, and to bring them together with Omura, as well as to tape record their stories for posterity. In so doing, aided strategically by many others, Chen succeeded in rescuing both Omura and the Nisei draft resistors from historical oblivion. Using the cultural politics vehicle of Reader's Theater, among other venues, he catapulted Omura, the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, and the draft resistors into the public eye, within and even outside of Japanese America. The result was the emergence of an alternative representation of the wartime imprisonment of Nikkei at great variance with that promoted by JACL spokespeople like Bill Hosokawa and Mike Masaoka. In 1991, Chen contributed an essay, Come All Ye Asian American Writers of the Real and the Fake, in his co-edited 1991 book, The Big IE, which celebrated the valiant roles of James Omura and the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee in mobilizing the draft resistance in the camps against the opposition of the U.S. government, the War Relocation Authority, and the Japanese American Citizens League. Later in 2002, Chen's classical oral history-driven documentary novel, Born in the USA, appeared in print. It detailed and dramatized the same inspiring message of bold resistance to oppressive power. While firmly rooted in historical evidence, this book employed the suppleness of imaginative literature to penetrate the core truths beyond the capacity of mere empirical documentation to capture and communicate. James Omura held Frank Chen in the highest regard. Like Omura, Chen deserves the respect and admiration of the Japanese American community for his contributions to its historical memory and corresponding human dignity. It should not be forgotten that in 1978, Frank Chen commenced the first day of remembrance to publicly dramatize the movement for redress and reparations, and that since that time, that annual event has become a touchstone for the Japanese American community to renew their commitment to democracy, social justice, and human and civil rights. I'm very pleased and honored that Frank Chen was able to be in attendance at this gathering, and I'd like to have him stand up for a second. Of course, the star contributor to Nisei Naysayer is the late James Omura, the memoir's author. Hopefully you will read and reflect upon what he has written in the book, but let me now provide you with a taste of what you have in store for you in his memoir by sharing with you his brief prologue. What is it that they say about third sons? This is the story of a third son of an immigrant family of 6 children, stricken early in life by tragedy that tore it apart. He came from a peculiar separatist-style society, felt the lash of economic discrimination in childhood, and was constantly reminded of his limitations springing out of his racial heritage. His struggles will take the reader to the far north, even beyond the Aleutian Island chains, to the parched Great Plains of North Dakota, a boxcar jaunt across the United States, the migrant trails of California, and his uncertain career in journalism on the Nikkei vernacular press. Most Asian American readers will more likely be interested in his editorial bout with the Japanese American Citizens League, of which he is noted as its leading critic. He won the sobriquet editorialist for his World War II editorials denouncing the internal policies of his government under the administration of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and was credited by the U.S. War Department as, quote, the single most influential voice in Japanese American camp resistance. Target of the U.S. Department of Justice, he was brought to trial in Cheyenne, Wyoming, acquitted by a federal court jury on November 1st, 1944. The verdict appeared to be a vindication of his editorial goal, but not among his own ethnic community in Denver, Colorado. The harassment and vindictiveness of his own people drove him into seclusion from Asia and America for over 30 years, and he emerged only in the fall of 1981 when recognized at his appearance at the Seattle, Washington hearing of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, which had been mandated by the Congress of the U.S. In the twilight of his life, he has won recognition in a variety of Who's Who's volumes published in the United States, England, and other nations, but he never expected any similar recognition among his ethnic contemporaries. In 1992, marking the 50th anniversary of Executive Order of 9066, the Grassroots National Coalition for Redress Reparations Northern California Division honored him at a candle-lighting ceremony in San Francisco, California, in the company of such prominent stalwarts of civil liberties as Wayne Millard Collins, Ernest Bessig, and Walt and Millie Woodward of Bainbridge Island, Washington, and the American Friends Service Committee. It was his second recognition from the Asian American community. Earlier in 1989, he was named the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Asian American Journalists Association. In the long reach of history, more lasting is his place in the chronicles of the time, in such works as Americans Betrayed by Morton Grodson, To Serve the Devil by Paul Jacobs and Saul Landon, Years of Infamy by Michi Nishiura Wegland, The Big IE by Frank Chen and others, Keeper of Concentration Camps by Richard Drennan, Concentration Camps USA by Roger Daniels, and Heart Mountain by Douglas Nelson. Countless literary works have appeared dealing with the historic Japanese-American World War II episode. Early chroniclers depended upon the propaganda claims of the War Relocation Authority JACL Consortium, while some later writers have buttressed this ideology by repeating the JACL propaganda foisted upon its non-discriminative public. The word betrayal was first heard on February 23, 1942 at the San Francisco hearings of the Tolan Congressional Committee. The most rabid accuser is the playwright-writer Frank Chen. Is Japanese American existing in a faked history? One can hardly argue against Chen. It is this writer who claims the JACL had written its leading critic out of Japanese American history. The Bill Hosokawa books commissioned by the JACL make no mention of its leading nemesis. If false fact takes root, declared Goethe in 1833, if it is generally assumed, if it becomes a kind of credo admitting no doubt or scrutiny, that is the real evil, one which has endured throughout the centuries. This book, which you will read, shall attempt to correct not all, but a small measure of that cockeyed history to which Japanese America has been exposed. Before opening up our event today with a Q&A session, I'd like to ask you to contemplate the message I have used as the epigraph for Nisei Naysayer. It's drawn from the 2017 book by Thomas Ricks entitled Churchill and Orwell, The Fight for Freedom. To refuse to run with the herd is generally harder than it looks. To break with the most powerful among that herd requires unusual depth of character and clarity of mind. But it's a path we should all strive for if we are to preserve the right to think, speak, and act independently, heeding the dictates not of the state or fashionable thought, but of our own consciences. In most places, and most of the time, liberty is not a product of military action. Rather, it is something alive that grows or diminishes every day in how we think and communicate, how we treat each other in our public discourse, in what we value and reward as a society, and how we do that. I'm now open to questions. I'll also welcome any statements you wish to make, as long as they are both brief and rendered with civility. Okay, thank you. There's a mic that will be taken around to you for the questions. So if you raise your hand, somebody else will spot you and take the mic there.
Hi, Mr. Hansen. By what logic, by what reason do the JACL have no apology to Mr. Omura? I mean, we're in the 21st century now, and I did see that footage where the JACL apologized to some of the resistors, but some JACL members did not arrive at that event for the apology. So, what in the world is happening? I mean, why are they? What are they saying?
I can't speak for the JACL, except I will say that from what I've been able to pick up impressionistically, there's a new JCL starting to form. I mean, the same organizational name, but with a different outlook. And I'm hoping that this suggestion I made here today about apologizing to James Omura will be acted upon. But that's up to the JCL. I'm not a JCL member and everything. And so it's up for the JCL to contemplate. It never would have passed before somebody like Bill Hosokawa and Mike Masaoka and lots of other old guard Japanese Americans who were in the JCL were still alive. But right now, there's a possibility of it. I mean, it has a much better possibility than, say, President Trump giving a Presidential Medal of Freedom to any of the people I mentioned.
Hi, I'm so happy that Jimmie Omura's memoir is finally coming out. And I'm really happy that you also recognize Frank Chen. I know that it was Frank Chen's 1981 Rafushimpo article in the holiday issue that got the draft resistors out of the closet. But I also want to give credit to Dwight Schumann, who was the editor of the Rafushimpo, who had the courage to publish a lot of the things that Frank Chen had written during that time.
Thank you. I would like to add to that in congratulating the Rafushimpo for something else that it did. In this case, it was the only publication of many, many that Omura sought to have his review of the Masaoka Hosokawa book, They Call Me Moses Masaoka. He tried so many times to get that book published from people, the mainstream and within the ethnic community, and nobody wanted to touch it. And actually, Chris Komai was then the editor of the Rafushimpo, and Chris Komai pushed to have that published. It was published in a serialized version, and that was a very important sort of breakthrough and an important thing for Jimmie. But I think it was also, an act of independence on the part of the Rafushimpo, consistent with some of the things that Dwight Schumann did before he was basically cashiered. Okay. Other questions? Yes, Irene.
I would also like to thank you for finally publishing this book after 20-something years.
Thank you. I, as I explained in the previous session, I didn't delay doing this because I was spiteful or anything else. I delayed doing it because I was a pretty busy person with a lot of other things. And as I mentioned, Mitchie Weglin had left me $20,000 in her will, and I didn't want to use it to buy a car or something else, something, fatuous like that. But I decided to name a book series after her, and we had the multicultural book series named after her and her husband, Walter. And we put out 7 books in 7 years that dealt with different multicultural communities. 3 of them were about Japanese Americans, including the orphanage in Manzanar, and then also another one dealing with doctors in all of the camps. So it was something that, and then I was running a Center for Oral and Public History at Cal State Fullerton, and it was pretty much running it on a shoestring, and it was generating soft money to get people salaries so that they could do what they were doing. But as I mentioned at the 1 o'clock, there was never a day that didn't go by that I didn't feel honored to be given this particular task. And also there was never a day when I didn't sort of take myself to task for having not yet finished it. And when Yosh Kuramiya and his lovely wife Irene, sitting in places like this and other places when I gave presentations, would always raise their hand and say, "How's that book coming on?" So it's finally off. In 2017, I had a major heart attack, and I was very happy that I survived that. I told Jimmie, I said, your reputation may not really, you're going to be a hero, but it may take 50 years. I didn't tell him that I was going to eat up about half of that time. So in any event, that's the story on that.
At least Yosh got to read your book.
Yeah, I was glad that he did, Yeah, I was happy that he did, and must have been one of the last things he did. Yeah. Right. And then, of course, Yosh Kuramiya has written his own memoirs, and that will be out, what would you say? Art Hansen is not editing it, so it may get out, before the next century, Okay?
Thank you for your lecture. I'm here, up here.
Oh, okay.
My question is, I was struck by Mr. Omura's assertion that he did not think the government would act against the Japanese American community if they resisted internment or eviction. Why was he so certain of that? I can understand the fear that the JCL had that they were going to be physically, forcefully removed.
Well,
Why did he think that that would not happen?
Somebody like Mike Masaoka, he talks about the ghettos and stuff. What ghetto did he live in? I mean, he wasn't from California. He didn't have his hand on the pulse of the Japanese American community in California. Omura was a newspaper editor. That's one of the things you do as a newspaper editor, is to understand the community. That's who the people are going to be, your readers or your future subscribers, et cetera. So he was a bright enough person to be able to assess the situation, and he wasn't frightened, and he didn't see evidence of hysteria. This business about hysteria being one of the things that was, responsible for the camps. I think the hysteria is, and he felt this way, was partially an invention of the JCL. This, as he said, to justify, going along and cooperating for future considerations. This was what they did. So that he didn't have any thought that there were going to, and he wasn't saying for this. He wasn't saying, oh, if they come, I'm going to go man the barricades, and the community, all of us are going to get together and fight the whole American military. So no, he wasn't saying something like. He just said, lay down a strong position that you object and that you expect indemnification for any sort of violation of your rights as American citizens. In other words, he spoke in terms of what constitutional rights are. But he thought that Mike Masaoka was scared, and that it's fear, as he said, is the thing that generated the sort of position that he took, that then was something that convinced a beleaguered people into following the JCL position. Now, they didn't follow it too much in the first couple of years, because every person that was seriously beaten in the camps almost was associated with the JCL. And it was in a lot of different camps. I cover all of that in my forthcoming book on Barbed Voices. What happened was when finally Japanese Americans started getting into the military, either as volunteers, which they did in early 1943 or later on through the draft. What happened was that Mike Masaoka was the first volunteer for the military. Of course, he didn't serve in battle. He served as a desk jockey. He was a person of public relations. And of course, when people's kids are over there ready to get slaughtered or maimed, et cetera, of course, all of a sudden you're going to support things. And the lifeline for him was all of the press things he sent out, mostly through the Pacific Citizen, which was headed up by his old friend who had been very much against the JCL, who was all of a sudden now the editor of the Pacific Citizen in Salt Lake City, and part of the JCL, and part of the group castigating Omura. And so, that kind of was the lay of the land at that time. Other questions? Yeah, you're welcome. I saw some other hands up over there. Yes. You wait for your mic. I didn't wait for mine for a while in this talk, so I'm sorry.
So in the short clip that we saw there, where Omura felt that he was vindicated, when he passed away, did he feel still the sting of any antagonist? I mean, did he pass away knowing that he did something really good? I mean, or did he die like an illusion that he was still hated? Amongst his
Well, he
community?
spent 13 years writing something that he wanted to be his testament for posterity. And he was encouraged by people constantly. And they always would frame it in a similar kind of way. You need to do this for the dignity of our people, for the Japanese American community. Since he didn't see the full consequences of his redemption, but at least got to see these awards that were given to him, and more importantly, the rallying around him of a lot of people in the community. He had grown up pretty much isolated from family. At age 13, he was off working in Alaska in the fish canneries, et cetera. His mother was gone from the time he was age 6. He never saw her again in his life, never saw half of his family again. They were in Japan, everything. His happiest years in his life were the first 6. The second happiest, and maybe even equal to it, were the last few years of his life, because then he felt he had a core of people who were his supporters, and looked at the world and did not marginalize him, did not demonize him, etc. So I think there was a lot of satisfaction in that he was able to do that. And a lot of satisfaction is that he finally got the community off his back, because they kept saying, when are you going to finish this book? You know, so he did finish the book. And as I said at the earlier thing, Mitchie Wegland used to make telephone calls on Sunday morning. I'm sure Frank Chen probably got some too. And long distance from New York, she'd have these long distance telephone calls, and she'd talk to Omura. And when she'd get on, talk to me, she said, Art, you know, every time I contact Jimmie at his house in Denver, when I call him, he said, he's watching some sports event. And like I told people, you know, I said, I could have told Mitchie, but I didn't. You know, that's exactly what I was doing when you called too. We were watching football or basketball or something on there. So both of us were big sport fans and everything. So, but yeah, I think the last part of his life, he did start feeling a certain satisfaction. Lane Hirabayashi invited him to give talks over at the University of Colorado. And there was a group in Denver called the Making Waves group. Marge Tanawaki was very much in the forefront of that. And they invited him to give talks, and they befriended him. Russell Endo, who had been a professor at the University of Colorado. Omura got a computer gift at the end of his life, and he went crazy trying to figure out how to do the computer. And it took more time than it would have if he stayed with the typewriter. But he'd have so many problems. And Jimmie was kind of socially sort of, shortchanged in some ways. He wasn't really good at social relations. And so he would call Russell Endo day or night, in the middle of the night, 3 a.m, because Jimmie would work on his book all night long. He'd say, I'm having a problem with this computer. Could you come over? So I've documented all of the times that Russell Endo had to come over and bail him out and stuff. So, but that was an act of somebody doing that, getting up in the middle of the night, knowing that he felt it was so important that he would come over and help him. So, I mean, I think that touched him a lot. Thanks for your question. Anybody else? Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Hansen. My name's Paul Meinrich.
I know you, Paul.
We've met before. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, I had an opportunity to be involved in representing some military resistors. And our case made its way to the Pentagon, and we had a hearing and so forth. And all of that was very important to the men I represented. And these guys were in the military, and they resisted, and they were court-martialed, et cetera. But Mr. Omura came to our meetings back in, I don't know if it was the late 70s or early 80s, but we met at a home here in Los Angeles to get our thing going. And one of the men who was the resistor, who was sentenced to 30 years in Fort Leavenworth, because he was the first one convicted of the court-martial conviction, named Kataoka, he fancied himself as a journalist, and he wrote articles, and he sent them to the newspaper in Japan. And so he knew Jimmie Omura, and Jimmie Omura came and helped us. And he was as stubborn and hard-headed as the rest of the guys that I represented, who had this sense of right with them. And Jimmie Omura and these guys, they're the kind of guys that we need just in the position that he was in and as a journalist. Thank God he was there and did what he did when he did, because it had to be said, and he said it, and no one was supporting him, and God bless him for it. But I want to thank him for the help he gave to me and the group that I represented, because he pushed us along and said, go for it, and so I want to thank him for that.
And he would reply to that he would like to thank you, Paul. He would like to say that he would wish that he had a son-in-law like you, since you, in pro bono fashion, devoted your time and energy to try to get exoneration for the military resistors. On the military resistors, I'd like to mention one thing. He had a sort of a loose chapter on the military resistors, which I cut. I think I told you, Paul. I cut that out of his thing. Only reason is because it didn't quite organically fit with the rest of the structure of the book, but also because Shirley Castelnuova put out a book, which actually I provided the title for, was Soldiers of Conscience. And that covered the same sort of ground. Now, he and Shirley didn't quite see eye to eye on things. And his chapter and stuff is available up in the archives. And I'm sure it's going to be digitized and it'll be accessible to anything. But he also interviewed a lot of people. I believe he interviewed, Omura even did an interview with you during the time. But in the Omura papers, there's interviews with the military resistors, not just with the draft resistors. And he took great pains to make sure that the military resistors would try to be recognized in the Smithsonian Institution exhibit. He wasn't altogether successful on that. He was promised that they would be, and then I think that promise was half fulfilled or not very much fulfilled. But he did want to make sure that the Nisei draft resistors and the military resistors, because the military resistors is an extremely important story. You should read Shirley's book on, Soldiers of Conscience. I mean, the treatment was horrible, so. Any other questions? Yeah. That's okay.
Can you, describe your editing process? I mean, and your relationship with Hansen. Like, how did you meet him? And like you mentioned just a little bit that
My
there's a part.
relationship with Hansen, I am Hansen.
Oh, excuse me.
Okay.
With Omura.
I haven't met myself yet.
I'm ADD here. Sorry. How did you meet Hansen? How did you meet Omura? How did you meet Omura? and when is trust and your editing process, like you alluded, like you had to edit some portions that you didn't want to do it, but you did.
Well, I spent a lot of time in the last session giving this backstory of exactly how I did. But let me just do the short version of it. I didn't know Jimmie. I just had heard of him through reading Roger Daniels' book, and then also Douglas Nelson's book on Heart Mountain. And I went to a conference on relocation and redress in Salt Lake City. And everybody stayed in hotels in Salt Lake City, but the actual site of the conference was on the edge of the city at the campus of the University of Utah. And they took a shuttle bus that would stop at each of the hotels. And I was at the Marriott, and then we went to other ones. And then this elderly gentleman at the time got onto the bus. And everybody was being convivial with one another and getting acquainted. And I introduced myself. I said, Art Hansen, I'm a history professor at Cal State Fullerton. And just as I was saying that, he turned around and I noticed that his ID said James Omura. And I said, "You're not by any chance the Jimmie Omura, are you? I thought you were long dead." And he said, "I am the Jimmie Omura," he said, "but I'm far from dead. I'm very much alive." So that's how I met him. And then we arranged that at some point in the future, I would do an interview with him. He told me that Frank Chen had already done an interview with him, and it was an interview that lasted 5 days. And then I did another 5-day interview with him. So between the two of us here, we got 10 days worth of tapings of Jimmie Omura, and they're all available. But that's how I got there. And we became friends in the course. He stayed at my house in Yorba Linda in Orange County. And I picked him up at a hotel in Los Angeles and brought him there and then delivered him back. And he was just so well prepared for the interview, and probably because he did this interview already with Frank. But he also, was up in the morning so early. Before my wife and I got up to go for breakfast, we'd come downstairs and he was in the living room sitting on the couch getting ready to be taped again. And even when the tape recorder broke down and we had to repair it, he kept talking on. He never stopped his narrative. This was a compelling sort of story that he wanted to tell. And I think he felt a big burden about telling it, for obvious reasons. So that's how we got to know each other. And then we communicated so much. I mean, this was the thing. He had a community of friends and supporters in those years. And a lot of it was through telephone calls, but also through writing. Email was just really getting going at that time, so there wasn't much on the email thing, but there was lots of letters. I might want to tell you that, the most literate and most interesting and most penetrating letters in the whole collections are the ones that Frank Chen was involved with. And there are also some great ones with William Horry, very articulate and very, searing and very illuminative kind of things. And then, of course, Michie Wegland. I mean, Michie Wegland simultaneously was one of the strong-heartedest, but also one of the kind-heartedest people. And never, you talk about sweet and sour, what a combination, a dynamic, combination of those two things. And all of us that were in the community loved Michie Wegland. I mean, most of us fell in love with her from looking at her picture on the back of cover of the, Years of Infamy. Then we actually read the book, and then the love was strong commitment, so. Any other questions? Well, if not, I'd like to thank you very much for being here. I hope you read the book. I hope you'll reflect on the book. I hope you will even act on the book in ways that you feel appropriate, not necessarily in ways in which I recommend it, because you are you and I'm myself, and that's it. So thanks a lot.